Hi everyone, welcome back to English for You. I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're talking about jazz. Jazz is a type of music that's popular with many people. It's kind of hard to define exactly what it is because it's a lot of things.
Sure.
But yesterday we kind of outlined a few typical features that turns up in not all jazz, but certainly quite a bit of jazz.
That's right. Jazz often has the stress on the offbeat when we're counting, when we're tapping our foot or dancing. This is what we're talking about. The stress on the offbeat means that the stress will be in the second and fourth beats in a 4-beat music measure. Often with pop music, it might be on the first and the third beat, whereas jazz, it's on the second and fourth more frequently.
Right. Jazz can also include improvisation, where melodies are just made up on the spot. They just kind of go off and do a little bit of a tune that isn't in the original song plan, because that's how they're feeling.
Even the artist who recorded it might play a version that's very different from the one they, put on the record years ago or even the day before, because they just feel like playing it in a different way. And another thing that they might use to make the music more expressive, more emotional, is feature bent notes, where a note that's higher or lower than expected is played on purpose. And this often is done to sort of copy the sound of a singer's voice, because people, when they sing, they often kind of slide notes around to get a bit more of an emotional feel to the song.
Okay, and all of these things help jazz kind of sound more fun, certainly more creative, and it gives it its own rhythm. And so jazz is often about breaking some of the more stricter rules of music that you'd have for classical music, that kind of thing. Today we're going to learn more about jazz. We'll talk a bit about the history and also some about the instruments that are used often in jazz. Let's read on.
Reading.
An introduction to jazz music. Jazz music was created by African American musicians around the turn of the 20th century in New Orleans, U.S. It grew out of blues and ragtime music. By the 1920s, it had become popular all over the U.S. Jazz has complex chords and a focus on improvisation, which draw in many musicians. Let's take a look at some typical instruments used in jazz music. Saxophone. This wind instrument is popular for performing melodies and harmonies. Trumpet, a brass instrument with a sharper and more focused sound. Drums. Often the player will use brushes instead of regular sticks for a softer sound. Double bass. The double bass provides a solid foundation for the song. Piano. On the piano, musicians need to communicate a strong sense of rhythm in their playing. Guitar. Jazz guitar is much quieter than rock guitar. It also helps communicate the rhythm, as well as guide the musician who is playing the melody. If you haven't already listened to jazz, you should give it a try. You'll be tapping your feet in no time.
All right, so as we're talking about this music style, let's talk about some of the history. And one of the basic questions, where and when was jazz first played? Well, we have a basic answer. Jazz music was created by African American musicians around the turn of the 20th century in New Orleans, U.S. And that's of course, in the state of Louisiana, down in the South. This is at the turn of the century. Now, that could mean at the turn of any century, because a century is just a period of 100 years. The turn of the century, when we think of that or read it in a history book, usually that means around 98, 99 into the next the next century, the 0001, 02, 03. So turn of the century we're talking about here, the 1890s probably up to the 1910s. From the 19th to the 20th century, or from the 1800s to the 1900s. Y2K, which of course was 20 years ago, that was the turn of the next century, the most recent century. So 1990s, the 2000s, that was the turn of another century.
Right. Of course, the sentence we gave you is a very simple part of the story. The history of jazz could fill and has filled many, many books. We've got a bit more information here. We see in the article, so jazz music, grew out of blues and ragtime music. So those are two different musical genres that were both around a little bit earlier, and jazz kind of formed out of that, grew out of those different styles as people added things and tried to do different stuff. Let's look at the phrasal verb grow out of. To grow out of something, this phrasal verb means to evolve from something. You use it to show something's starting point, and it kind of explains how it took parts of what it grew from, but then developed off on its own way to become its own thing. Okay, you might talk about different sports which grew out of something else. Soccer has been around for a long time, but the football that's played mostly in the US grew out of different types of soccer and different ways that people played that. One of the musics we mentioned, one of the genres we mentioned is ragtime. Ragtime is music that has a kind of ragged rhythm. It doesn't follow that simple rhythm. It's a bit more ragged. It goes kind of all over the place. So we've got jazz kind of arriving in the late 1890s, early 1900s and 1910s.
That's right, but it became very well known, very famous, and very popular. So by the 1920s, it had become popular all over the US. And this kind of followed a lot of the train routes, right? It went up to Chicago, over to New York, the big cities, and then to the smaller places, and soon everybody was playing jazz. And they had sort of local centers for it, St. Louis, Kansas City, out west in LA, and different styles of jazz started to kind of follow along with that as more and more people put more creativity into this very free style of music.
Okay, so that's a bit of the history. Let's talk some more generally about jazz. We see jazz has complex chords and a focus on improvisation, like we said yesterday, which draw in many musicians. So both of these things, this kind of complexity, this idea that you can get creative, this really is attractive to people who play music. It's like, I don't need to keep playing the same songs. I can get a bit different. I can try new stuff. A lot of people like that. So a chord, we mentioned chord there. This is multiple notes that are played together, so they are all one single sound. That's how they sound when the notes are played together.
That's right. Instead of just playing one note on the piano, you're using several fingers playing these notes. They all sound nice in relation to each other. Gives you a fuller, richer sound, and you're playing a chord, just like on a guitar. To draw in is basically to attract, to interest. You're kind of pulling people in. It's something that will mean it's attractive, it's desirable, it's very interesting. You know, if you're a salesperson and you are trying to sell something outside on the street, you want to draw in a crowd, get more people to come over and listen to you. Maybe you'll find a customer, or the smell from a restaurant or a bakery might draw in the customers. It's attracting people because they're like, ooh, that smells good. I'm going to go buy some of that. All right, now let's talk about how you make the jazz.
With difficulty, it seems, based on what we've learned.
And you need the right tools.
Yes, as the article says, let's take a look at some typical instruments used in jazz music. Now, we're not going to give a full list here of all the different ones because you could basically use anything.
Pretty much.
Yeah, but an instrument, of course, is something, a tool, you could almost say a machine, for making sounds and making music, okay? So this is all different types, from the string ones like guitars and violins to things you hit, things you blow into, things that are made of metal, things that are made of wood, and even like modern instruments. You'd be using a lot of computers, keyboards, synthesizers, that kind of thing. So we might ask, what instrument is Yo-Yo Ma famous for playing?
Ah, okay. He's famous for playing the cello.
The cello.
Right, which is a big violin, basically. All right, so let's look at some of the instruments you'll find more frequently in jazz music, because there are some differences between jazz and classical, especially. And here's one, saxophone. Yeah, you'll find the saxophone used in jazz a lot, whereas in classical music, it's less common. It was a much more modern instrument, but it's very popular in jazz. This wind instrument is popular for performing melodies and harmonies. It's often a lead instrument. That's sort of maybe the band leader, maybe the person who plays the first solo, and it will certainly be playing a lot of the main melodies. And of course, people like John Coltrane and Charlie Parker are very famous for playing the saxophone, along with many, many others. But yes, many jazz bands will feature a saxophone. Let's talk about this word harmony. And we have this word harmony. Now, this is a noun, and harmony is basically where those notes that we're playing, they sound good when put next to other notes. Different notes, but they are joined in a way that makes our brain very, very happy. When we play a chord, for example, we're not just playing one note, we're probably playing at least 4 notes, but we're not just picking any key, any note to play on the piano. No, we're playing the notes that sound good in harmony. They sound good together when they're played together at the same time. And it's amazing, our brain just kind of knows harmony. You don't have to be a musician, you might be a terrible singer, but if someone is playing something and they play a note that's just off, you will definitely go, "Ooh, what was that? That didn't sound right." That's your brain sensing that the harmony there was broken by playing a wrong note. So harmony is one of those things we're just able to hear.
Okay, so that's the saxophone. Let's move on to our next instrument, trumpet. A brass instrument with a sharper and more focused sound.
Yes, of course.
Okay, we often group instruments into different kind of classes. We talk about the strings, violin, cello, double bass, and all of those. We've got wind instruments like the saxophone and flutes, and now we have brass instruments. Now, this does mean they are made of brass, a particular kind of metal, but they all have a sort of similar sound. They're generally made by blowing into that kind of thing. So we've got trumpets and trombones and different types of horns. Tuba, of course, okay. So we might say, for example, the brass section only plays on the second half of the song. So that'll make it so it'll play with the first, maybe with some guitars and stuff, and then the brass will come in a bit later, maybe lively things up a bit.
Right, yeah, make it much brighter, often much louder. And of course, when we think of trumpet players, we think of one of the people who really started jazz, Louis Armstrong. From New Orleans, one of the greatest trumpet players, and one of the most important people in modern music. Actually, reading about Louis Armstrong, it's quite amazing. So many things he did for the very first time. So definitely an interesting character to look for. Next, we have drums, right? We've been talking about rhythm. We've been talking about offbeat. We've been talking about many types of jazz can get you to dance and tap your foot. And a lot of that comes down to the drums. These are the things that people will hit with sticks to make a loud banging noise, and you hit it in a regular way, and you have rhythm. It says often the player will use brushes instead of regular sticks for a softer sound. Yeah, they actually use, it looks like a stick. You hold the stick part, it's got some metal wires that sound like brushes, and it gives you a softer sound, especially for those slower songs. When something is regular, like the regular sticks, it's normal, right? So having chopsticks, having regular chopsticks in Taiwan are often made of bamboo or wood or something. But maybe if you're at a fancy restaurant, they might have silver chopsticks or something. But that's not very regular, that's not very common, that's not what you expect to see. So a regular something is the common one. It is the one you expect. For example, the regular time for Holly to get up every day is 7:30 a.m., but of course, if it's a holiday or a typhoon day, she can sleep in a bit.
Okay, so we've got saxophone, we've got trumpet, we've got the drums.
Right.
So drums is a good place to move on to the next instrument, the double bass, because they're part of the rhythm.
That's right.
Doing the rhythm for the song. We see the double bass provides a solid foundation for the song. The double bass is the one that's about the size of a person or bigger.
It's a giant violin.
Yeah, you can kind of hide behind it and reach around to play it, that big thing there. So here we're talking about it giving a solid foundation for the song. Now here we don't mean solid like a stone is solid, it's just this big thick thing, but we mean it in the way that it can be trusted, you can depend on it, it's going to do the job, and you can build on top of it. Not literally build like putting things, but you can layer other sounds on top of the double bass because it gives such a solid foundation to what's going on. It's very easy to kind of follow the rhythm with it and so on. For example, you might say, it's a pretty solid laptop. I've had it for 4 years and I've never had a problem with it. We don't mean it's a big thick brick of a laptop.
It could be.
It could be.
That's not what we're talking about.
No, we mean it's reliable. It always works. It does what I want it to do. It's not breaking down. It's not sometimes working slowly for no reason. It's just a very good, reliable laptop that does the jobs we need it to do. So here we've got a foundation for the song. What do we mean here?
Well, it's kind of like the floor. When we're talking about putting up a new building, you would want a solid foundation, right? If you're going to build a building, you've probably never built one. I know I haven't, but what would be better? To build your building on a nice big piece of rock that then you can put the floor down and the walls and the roof? Or are you going to build it out in the beach where the water will come in, the sand will move, the walls will start to fall down, and eventually the whole house will fall down? That will not give you a solid foundation. The rock will, because the foundation is the bottom part of the building. It's what you build everything on. That, of course, is in a very real way when talking about buildings, but we can also talk about foundations as basically being the basic thing you need to start with, and then you can go on and add things. So having a basic educational foundation, knowing how to read, how to write, how to do simple math problems, that might be all you need, but you definitely can't learn the really complicated stuff if you don't know how to read and write and do simple math. So that's another idea for a foundation. It's the basic stuff, and then you can go on and get more complicated and move on from that, but without the foundation, you're in trouble.
Yeah, so the foundation, is it the rhythm, the melody, or a bit of both here?
Both, but definitely the melody, because otherwise no one knows when to change, no one knows when to begin and end, and the song will kind of feel like it doesn't have a direction.
Okay, so that is important to get that rhythm section in, the sort of the bass, the drums and stuff, and another one that can help with that is piano. On the piano, musicians need to communicate a strong sense of rhythm in their playing. Okay, it's pretty important, and here we're using the word communicate. Let's check that out. Now, of course, when we think of communicating, we're often thinking of talking to people, writing to people, and so on. But in this case, we're using the word communicate to mean to make someone understand an idea or feel an emotion, but without expressing it so directly in words, okay? Think of a horror movie. You could just say, have someone going, oh, it's a really scary house, don't go in there, there's bad things. But if you have some creepy music, it's not communicating it directly, but it's definitely giving you an idea, oh, this is a scary place. I feel uncomfortable. The music is making me feel something bad is going to happen. It's the same way with music. They're giving you the idea. They're not explaining it. They're not giving you a note saying this is what it is. They're making you feel something more indirectly. Here's an example. The artist communicates with her audience through dance and poetry. The way she dances and moves, or the words she reads out, they're not giving you a message directly, but you understand what she's trying to say, the message she wants to give out. So we've had saxophone, trumpet, drums, double bass, piano. What are we missing?
Well, why not have a guitar in there too? That can complement everyone quite well. It says guitar, of course. Everyone knows the guitar. The six-string type is the most common one, but they come in all shapes and sizes. And jazz guitar is much quieter than rock guitar. So we're not thinking of the screaming heavy metal solos. The guitar in jazz often takes the place of the piano, kind of providing some backing melody as well as some rhythm along with the drum and bass. having the guitar be the lead instrument, like the saxophone or trumpet, is much less common in jazz than it is in other types of popular music. But yeah, jazz guitar is a very interesting sideline field, and a lot of great jazz guitar players out there too.
Okay, as kind of Mike explained there, the guitar, the jazz guitar, it also helps communicate the rhythm as well as guide the musician who is playing the melody.
Right.
So it's more of a support instrument than a lead instrument, that kind of thing.
But if you learn jazz guitar, you will learn many interesting chords that require you to put your fingers in very unusual positions. So it's a great thing for anyone who wants to play guitar to learn. Learn jazz guitar, then you'll know how to play almost anything else. If you haven't already listened to jazz, you should give it a try. Yeah, why not? Give it a try. You can find some great song lists on the internet. Pick up something at your local music store. Watch some documentaries. There's all sorts of good stuff out there.
Okay, and as the article says to finish off, you'll be tapping your feet in no time. Of course, to tap means to hit lightly. We often think of it with our fingers. I'm tapping the palm of my hand, something like that. He's tapping me on the shoulder. Tapping the foot just means your heel will be on the ground, but the toes in the front bit are moving up and down. Here's another example. Filbert tapped on the glass to get the bank teller's attention. He's not banging, going, "Oi, you." He's just, "Hey, excuse me, tap, tap, tap. Here's a noise, pay attention to it."
There you go. And put on some good jazz and you will probably be a fan in no time. This phrase basically just means very quickly, almost right away. You won't have to listen to jazz for 9 years to suddenly go, "I like jazz." No, it may be after 20 minutes seeing a band or listening to one of those great recordings, you'll be a fan very quickly in no time.
All right, that brings us to the end of our article, so let's go to our For You Chat question.
For You Chat.
So our article's question is, how does your favorite kind of music use different instruments?
Very interesting question. I mean, music can use instruments in all kinds of ways. It's often interesting when people use them in unusual ways, like if you play the melody on the bass guitar instead of on the guitar or a saxophone. That can be very interesting. And also there's lots of technical things that people can do with their guitars. You can play them through special boxes that change the sounds. You can do things even with your hands that can make the sound of the guitar very unusual. So I think it's really just about coming up with something creative, doing something that sounds unique, that maybe no one's ever done before or no one's used in that way. But one of the things that musicians love is creativity. And in some ways, the machines of today make it almost too easy to be creative. It might have been more fun back in the old days when people had limited options, but they had to find very creative and new ways of doing it. But musicians love to try new things.
Yeah, I think of, I know you've played in a ska band, a type of reggae band. Yeah. So the brass section in there is quite important, right? For the melody, is that right?
Yep, generally for the melody, they'll be playing the lead, the head. Yep.
Exactly. So that's just an example of where all the trumpets and trombones are maybe doing a bit more of the lead work, whereas in another type of music, it's all about, oh, what's the guitarist doing, that kind of thing.
And in music like reggae, the guitar is basically a rhythm instrument. You often don't even hear a guitar solo at any point.
Exactly. It's kind of going along in the background softly. You can pay attention to it, but it won't be leading the way. Like with heavy metal, you're looking for those powerful solos, big driving stuff. And in heavy metal, you've got what's like the double bass drum pedal that gives it the real thumping bass line. Kind of stuff going on. So yeah, lots of different ways to use music in different types of music, depending on what you do with the instrument. That's all we got time for. Thanks for watching, everybody. For English for You, I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
And we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Vocabulary Review.
Instrument. Emma plays several instruments, including the piano and the violin. Brass. I love the loud and deep sounds that certain brass instruments, such as French horns, can make. Regular. Jake's new car looks just like a regular car. I don't know why he thinks it's so special. Solid. My friendship with Michael is solid. We've been helping each other for over 20 years. Communicate. Dogs can't talk, but they often communicate their emotions to us by using their body language. Tap. Adam likes to finger drum by tapping a beat with his fingers on the table.
智慧小补帖
Chord. Harmony. Foundation.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作，活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net